This is Anarchast.
Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchast, this time coming to you from Southern California, a little bit north of San Diego in Carlsbad, where I'm here personally for the Doug Casey conference, The Politicized Economy, and I was very happy to have Gary Chartier come down. He lives about an hour north of here, and he's written many books. He's written a book called Conscience of an Anarchist. He's the Associate Dean at the La Sierra University, and he's currently writing another book, and thanks for joining me.
Great to be here, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I told you the first question I ask everybody, how did you become an anarchist?
Sure. So it's kind of a long, convoluted story for me. You know, I grew up, I think, with a lot of the characteristics that, realistically speaking, lots of folks in my generation who were budding libertarians might have had, which is to say that I had parents who were enthusiasts for Barry Goldwater. I read science fiction, I programmed computers, and I had limited social skills. And I started out throughout adolescence on a pretty conventional libertarian path. I was reading the Hayek and Rothbard and Mises, or not Mises, but who else? Nozick and Robert Anton Wilson, and was really, I think, set up probably to proceed into a relatively conventional libertarian adulthood, if there are things like that. And then I got to college and I got derailed. And I got derailed, probably as a lot of people do, by discovering that the world was a big, messy place full of lots of bad stuff and lots of suffering, and I was kind of overwhelmed by that, and I wasn't sure how an effective libertarian response to that might be framed. And so I took a bit of a detour after that into a pretty conventional statist politics as I went on to grad school, into law school. And then I found myself drawn back and re-radicalized, in an important sense, I think more radicalized than I had been before, by George Bush and Barack Obama, who really demonstrated how absolutely abysmal the abuse of state power could be and how utterly untrustworthy state officials could be. And because of that, there was a new opening for me, I think, to the libertarian ideas that I'd embraced before, but where before I perhaps had been in some vague sense, you know, a kind of minarchist, I became a full-blown anarchist at that point. I think I'd realized ever since graduate school that arguments for state authority weren't any good, and I had just kind of filed that away in the back of my mind and hadn't really done very much with it. There was an English philosopher called Stephen Clark, whose work had been quite important to me in grad school, who, I thought, demolished those arguments. And so by the time I encountered the awfulness of the early 2000s, I was kind of intellectually prepared to come home, and I'm very glad I did. And I discovered the work of people like Roderick Long and Sheldon Richman and Kevin Carson and Charles Johnson, who really gave me a vocabulary that I could use and a set of conceptual tools I could use to simultaneously re-embrace that earlier libertarianism and deal with, in a more constructive way, the various problems that had propelled me into my statist detour. So
we can thank George Bush and Barack Obama for converting
for something.
You.
Yeah. Hard to see what else, but
yeah, well, they're really helping us to convert people.
Absolutely. Because
it's quite obvious their stuff doesn't work and it just makes things worse. And
absolutely.
If you're, at least have your eyes open, you can see that. And unfortunately, Ron Paul got derailed there. Did you have any thoughts on Ron Paul, or are you completely apolitical?
I'm not completely apolitical, but I am getting more and more skeptical about electoral politics as an avenue for social change, because what I observe is that almost everybody, I think Ron Paul is a striking exception, but almost everybody who ends up in office finds it very easy to sacrifice principle very quickly. And
Ronald Reagan?
You know, anybody you pick your favorite politician and ask yourself, did that politician live up to what he or she promised on the campaign trail? And the answer is almost always no.
Yeah, I'm rewatching The Lord of the Rings again for about the 20th time.
Excellent.
And you know, that ring, that really is state power. It's the power of the state, and it corrupts everybody, even Frodo. And it would have been interesting to see if Ron Paul did get in, what would happen.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Ron Paul had a long history of saying no to the abuse of state power. I think precisely for that reason, the odds of his making it, you know, into the White House would have been extremely low, not only because many voters, I think, want presidents to do things,
right.
and the thought of a president who's not interested in doing something is scary to people,
right.
but also clearly because the people who pump money into campaigns don't want politicians who aren't going to give them goodies. Yeah. They clearly want the most opportunities for rent-seeking possible, and clearly a politician who wants to eliminate those opportunities is going to be anathema to them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sad too how the state corrupts everything.
Yes.
So it corrupts everybody, even myself, and probably somehow corrupted in some way by the state. You know, because with the state power, if you don't use the things that you can from the state, then you're at a disadvantage. And
right.
then other people, for example, patents.
Right.
I have no interest in patents.
Yeah.
I've never patented anything. I've created lots of things, but never patented anything, and I never will. But if I don't, I have a very real chance of having some people with guns from the U.S. government show up one day and saying, you can't do this anymore because someone else patented
right.
it. So it corrupts. It corrupts everybody. It corrupts all of society. I think Leo Tolstoy said that the state eventually corrupts everybody. And so it would have been interesting to see if Ron Paul did get in, but obviously he didn't come close. He couldn't even win the GOP. Well, he did, but they probably stole it from him or whatever they did, all the corrupt and dirty politics they do.
Well, we certainly saw at the convention how intent the Romney forces were on eliminating even the slightest show of support for Ron. So yeah. It was pretty devastating.
Yeah, they can't allow that kind of talk or philosophy to catch on very much, because if it does, those guys just go away. They just disappear.
Right.
So.
Their sense of self and their power and their wealth all depend on access to the kind of state power that sensible people would like to get rid of. So.
Right. And so you teach at the business school. Do you get an opportunity to put in some of your libertarian or anarchist ideology to some of the kids?
Well, so sometimes
and
I do talk.
Counteract that statist, socialist sort of that's much more predominant in the universities?
You know, I talk about a variety of issues. I expose students to a variety of ideas. Some of those ideas are not ideas necessarily that I want to embrace, but it's a university, and so one thing that's important is to make sure people learn to think critically about all the cavalcade of stuff that they're confronted with. But I do certainly talk in some classes about issues related to state power and to ways in which, for instance, students who are learning to be business leaders have to ask, let's say they're thinking about, quote, business ethics, not just about, you know, is this particular act in relation to some other individual morally responsible on my part or not, but how should I go about thinking about my relationship to state power? What should I do in terms of using that power to beat down the competition, which is something we know that's very tempting. It's very tempting for people in a lot of business environments to say, you know, I'm going to use my association with the state to get rid of the competition. We've seen it over and over again. And so I do try to get people to think about those kinds of issues.
That's great. And how is it received?
Shocked, you know, I think,
stunned?
Yeah, I think honestly, yes. That is, I think most students, even in a business program, are typically people who have breathed in the conventional political wisdom with the air that surrounds them, and they don't find it easy to envision alternatives, and they tend to find the thought of non-state ways of solving social problems odd. They don't know what to do with that, they're puzzled by it, and they're often resistant to it because it seems to them, because it's the only thing they've seen, that if the state isn't involved in solving the problem, it won't get solved. And they're often, I think, I want to be nice to my students, but I think they're not immediately sensitive to the degree to which the state is responsible very often for the problem. Instead, they think of the state somehow as a solution. You know, my friend Tom Knapp, for instance, I know likes to talk about, well, actually, sorry, this isn't Tom Knapp, it's Harry Brown. You know, the state breaks your leg and then offers you crutches. Well, if it would stop breaking legs, crutches would be a lot less important.
Right. Talking about your book, recently Jeffrey Tucker did a glowing recommendation of your book. He said not only is it the most important book in the last few years, but maybe in the last few decades, and maybe ever, he said, I believe. And that was quite a glowing thing coming from a great guy like Jeffrey Tucker. So it definitely caught my attention. I haven't read it yet, The Conscience of an Anarchist.
Yeah.
And can you maybe tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So first of all, thanks again to Jeff for doing a great interview and for promoting the book. Jeff's support has really been very much appreciated. Conscience of an Anarchist is intended to be a short, accessible book for people who know something's wrong with the political scene but aren't sure what, and who are open to the possibility of being radicalized. As we know, there's a whole history in American politics of conscience books, from Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative to Krugman's Conscience of a Liberal, and I think there may have been another book with that title as well, to the odious Zell Miller, who wrote a book called The Conscience of a Conservative Democrat, to Wayne Allen Root, who gave us The Conscience of a Libertarian. Make of that what you will, especially now that Wayne has shown his true colors by heading back to the Republican Party. But in any event, I wanted to continue that conversation in a more radical way. I also wanted to continue it by following Goldwater's lead in producing a small, easily digestible book. You know, this book is under 120 pages. It's something you ought to be able to read easily in an afternoon, and it's organized in what I hope is a pretty simple, clear way. It makes the case that the state is illegitimate, unnecessary, and dangerous. What does that mean? So first, illegitimate, states often say, what justifies our authority? You consented to it. You accepted that authority. And I try to show in a few pages why that idea is just nonsense, why that's just not the case, why the state doesn't enjoy that kind of consensual grounding. Then the fallback position is the one we get, say, from Thomas Hobbes. We need the state to maintain social order or we'll all kill each other. And so I try to talk about ways in which that's just implausible, that both on theoretical grounds and on practical, historical grounds, we have good reason to believe that people can organize themselves peacefully and cooperatively without some kind of top-down management. Then I get into what is, in a sense, the meat of the book, which is explaining why the state is dangerous. And I organize that along three fronts. First of all, I talk about the way in which the state offers economic goodies to elites and their cronies, and simultaneously, therefore, makes and keeps other people poor. State action is just destructive in the economic realm. I also talk about how state action in the international realm, especially war, is hugely destructive. Talk about the ways in which the 20th century has witnessed enormous amounts of death and destruction, but also how that then feeds back into what goes on at the domestic level by boosting domestic authoritarianism and making criticism of the regime more difficult and so forth. So there's a kind of mutually reinforcing relationship between aggression overseas and aggression at home. And then I talk about the way in which the state is also dangerous at the level of personal freedom, the way in which it interferes with peaceful behavior in a broad range of ways, and in which the growing militarization of police forces and the growing just legal empowerment of police forces is terribly dangerous to us, and how as long as you have the kind of immunity and status that those agencies possess, because they're backed up by state power, the more and more dangerous things become for the rest of us. So I lay that case out, and then in the final chapter I talk much more tentatively about a range of complementary strategies for making change happen. I'm willing, as I suggested earlier, to talk in limited ways about the potential merits of electoral politics, though, as I say, I'm getting more and more skeptical about that. But at the same time, I also talk about everything from education to creating alternate institutions, the kind of seasteading model that puts alternatives on display and makes it harder for the state to claim that its approach is inevitable and necessary, to agorist approaches, so that, you know, people just tunnel under the state, as it were, and create their own institutions in kind of wonderful oblivion. So a whole range of complementary strategies that might lead us toward a future where people could really express their creativity and their ability to cooperate with each other to make wonderful things happen that we can't even begin to imagine yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we really have no idea what humanity can do if it's actually unleashed. If
Absolutely.
It's
Absolutely.
Because we have so very little freedom today. I think, well, we definitely are. We're the least free we've ever been in history, as far as I'm concerned. Just today, just coming here, I had to wait 2 hours just to come through the, I flew, thanks to the free market, on an airplane. I flew 2,000 miles in about 3 hours, and I spent 2 hours trying to go about 500 feet to get through the border, to get my papers checked, So
Yeah, borders certainly are a very painful reminder of just how destructive states are. I mean, I would want to say, I don't think it's all a kind of uniform trip downhill. After all, the large fraction of Americans who were enslaved 100 years ago, 150 years ago, might well say that, you know, things were pretty awful then. So I don't want to engage in some kind of romanticizing of the past. There were pretty crappy acts of violence and theft in the past, too. But I guess today, because of greater communication technologies and greater social wealth, it's easy to see how certain possibilities are just almost within reach if we could just reach out and achieve them without the interference of thugs with guns.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And a lot of people say to me the things I talk about, and I talk about how the states are probably going to collapse. The socialism is just impoverishing everybody, and it eventually will collapse. And all these nation states are all heavily into debt.
Absolutely.
The system is not sustainable at all, and it will go away at some point. And a lot of people say to me, well, that's a very pessimistic outlook. And I say, it's the most optimistic outlook I can think of. These states are just out of control. They're in every aspect of our lives today. And if we can lessen that or even get rid of it completely, and not through violence, but through thought, through changing the way we think, we could go on to just amazing things. And one of the books I read that's actually the book I think that really turned me into an anarchist, was The Market for Liberty.
Yes.
And it was just because they pointed out how it could work. It might not work that way, but how it could in an anarchist society. And I just got so excited at the thought. For example, courts. Today, if you want to go to court, it's going to be years. It's going to cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. If it was all free market private courts, you'd probably be in and out in a day for very cheap. Even right now on the internet, they have things like Judge.me.
Right.
So it's all very exciting, and I'm surprised that more people aren't more excited about it. I guess they probably just haven't heard about it.
Well, I think one of the real problems that anybody who wants to talk about a genuinely freed market, a genuinely liberated society, has to confront is the fact that so many people are immersed in a statist culture that makes it impossible for them to think alternate thoughts, And so I don't believe that the issues are just cultural. I think that there are kind of structural and other kinds of, approaches that need to be taken. But the cultural issues really matter. The educational stuff really matters because people can't see alternatives. When you're blind to that possibility, you simply can't reach out and take things that are right in front of you. You can't accept wonderful possibilities. And that's, of course, why I think states are so threatened when those alternatives are put on display. One of my favorite historical characters is a guy named Clarence Jordan, who was a pretty idiosyncratic Southern Baptist minister in the early part of the 20th century. And he created in the Red Hills of Georgia something called Koinonia Farms, which was a funky kind of place where beatniks and proto-hippies and black sharecroppers could all come together and just work together on the land. And what was interesting was how much violence this provoked, how much threat and violence it provoked on the part of people who weren't in any way being affected, but whose vision, for instance, of a segregated society was so unsettled by the fact that somebody put on display that an alternative was possible, just showing that, hey, people who don't look the same, who don't come from the same kind of background, can work together and get along peacefully and voluntarily and cooperatively without somebody standing there holding a gun over their heads. That scared people, and there were threats and there was violence and so forth. States are like that. States don't want to see you show alternatives, because the alternatives liberate the imagination. And when the imagination is liberated, great things can happen.
It is amazing, if you talk to someone who is a statist, or even I've had conversations like this with objectivists or other people, and if we even just start talking about these things that we're talking about, they get very angry. It's like we're shaking their world or something. And it's a very interesting response. I would never get angry at seeing an idea. There's no idea you could say that would make me angry. You could say, I like communism. I go, well, that's killed hundreds of millions of people, but I wouldn't be like physically shaking.
Right.
I'd be like, if you want to do it, go do it, but don't get me involved.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Getting back to your book,
absolutely.
Where can people get the book?
Well, so the book is available in two forms right now. It's available in print, at the Cobden Press website, which is freeminds, fr33minds.com, and it's now available in an ebook form to members of the Laissez-Faire Book Club, Jeff Tucker's operation.
Great. And then you're working on another one right now, too?
I am. I'm working on a more scholarly book called Anarchy and Legal Order, which is coming out from Cambridge University Press in November.
Great.
And it's really an attempt to lay out in a more rigorous fashion what I see as the kind of moral and practical foundations of a commitment to a stateless society, a stateless dispute resolution order, and so forth, and then to talk a bit about how that might work and what the contents of the optimal rules that it might maintain might be. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be looking forward to that one.
Just so you know, right now it's coming out in hardback, and hardback academic books are prohibitively expensive. I have been promised that within a year there will be a paperback that ought to be somewhat more affordable.
Oh, great. And electronic version? Or?
I'm sure that Cambridge will produce electronic versions. I'm not sure what the timetable is for those.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for today, so I'd like to thank you for being on with us.
Once again, a pleasure to talk, Jeff.
All right, and that's all for Anarchast. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Peace, love, and anarchy.
Peace, love, and anarchy.